Well, welcome back here on Live Now from Fox 2:30 over on the East Coast and 11:30 on the West Coast. The latest now on Hurricane Hilary. Take a look at your screen. That is the latest X-rad image coming in from our radar system. The already powerful storm continues to intensify in the Pacific, strengthening from a tropical storm to a Category 4 hurricane in less than 48 hours. Forecasters expect the storm could become a Category 5, which, by the way, is the highest classification for a hurricane, showing the power of this very large storm. I do want to talk more about all of this. Barry Keim is the Louisiana State climatologist and professor in the Department of Geography and Anthropology at Louisiana State University. He joins us now live to discuss the track and everything else about Hilary. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course. So first off, the question on everyone's mind right now, what is the projected path of Hurricane Hilary?
Okay, so for starters, the storm is about 500 miles west of Puerto Vallarta, out in the middle of the Pacific. Its current strength is Category 4 with 145 mile an hour sustained winds. And the track right now, they have the thing actually moving or tracking, almost due north. It's kind of a north-northwest kind of track, which will take it right up the Baja Peninsula of Mexico, and eventually it'll bring it into the United States, into California. So right now it looks like things will really start breaking down on the Baja Peninsula as the day wears on today, and into tomorrow. And then as we get into Sunday, we'll start feeling this thing in the United States. And it's, like I said, right now it's Category 4. There is potential for this thing to blossom up to even Category 5. The cutoff for Category 5 is, I think, 157 miles per hour. So once it gets to 157 and greater, we're at Category 5 strength. We're at 145 right now. But it's going to start moving over, eventually start moving over colder water as it starts to approach California. And then it's expected to weaken. And whether it's Category 1 or tropical storm strength, by the time it reaches California, still remains to be seen. So we'll be watching this real carefully. And I also want to emphasize, very small shifts in the track could lead to dramatically different conditions in California and how this all plays out.
For sure. And what do we expect to see there in Southern California? Based right now on the track itself, I imagine we're talking about some very heavy rain, some high surf, winds that are gusting, as we mentioned, more than 80 miles an hour or so. What else do we expect to see there?
Well, given that's a fairly arid landscape, especially as we move inland, we could be literally looking at a year's worth of rain falling in 24 hours. I mean, that's not out of the realm of possibilities. We're looking at 5 to 10 inches of rain could certainly fall within this mountainous area. Obviously, the high altitudes, the places that have some rugged topography, those are the areas that are most likely to see those really, really high rainfall amounts. So, and given that kind of landscape, landslides and things of that nature are certainly in the cards. So, this area doesn't normally see these kinds of storms. In fact, that's my understanding is the last, sort of tropical storm hurricane to hit Southern California was back in 1939. So we're pushing some years now. And to drop this kind of rain in that area will definitely have some impacts. But like I said, the tracking is really going to be interesting. If it veers a little bit more towards the east, we're looking at more rainfall into Arizona and perhaps even into Nevada. California's obviously going to get some rain, but whether those other states, how much they receive, will be interesting. If it veers maybe just a little bit off to the west, then Los Angeles is actually looking at bearing some of the brunt of this as well. So this storm definitely bears watching from the perspective of Southern California, because it's going to get very interesting there in the next 24, 48 hours.
For sure. And taking a look at the size of the storm right now, that is a live look from our X-rad radar system. You can see just how large it is. How does the size of this storm compare to some of the other hurricanes? Is it larger than most just based on what I'm looking at right now? I'm guessing the answer is yes.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't have the specific dimensions of the storm, but I mean, I'm comparing this storm to some of the Gulf hurricanes, which I'm used to dealing with. I mean, if you plot this storm in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, I mean, the feeder bands and the cloud shield would take up the entire Gulf of Mexico. That's not typical. I mean, we've had a few storms like that in the past. Hurricane Gilbert comes to mind way back in the 1980s. I remember that storm being out in the Gulf of Mexico, and and it filled the entire Gulf. Well, this storm would do the same thing. So this storm definitely ranks as one of the the bigger storms that I've ever seen. So it is a monster. There's no doubt about it. And the thought that this thing can go up to Category 5 just makes it all the scarier. The upside being that, once this thing continues its trajectory northward, it's eventually going to get over some cold water, and it's gonna weaken in its intensity pretty dramatically. And by the time it reaches, the northern part of the Baja Peninsula and starts to reach California, it's likely to be right around that tropical storm hurricane threshold. So again, that's the thing that really bears watching at this point. So obviously we need to keep a close watch on this thing.
And I want to get your opinion on this, because I know initially folks said, yes, it would become a hurricane. It may not be as powerful as it is right now, but I guess the expectation be that it would become up to a Category 5 hurricane when this was initially being tracked?
Well, you never really think these storms are going to get this bad. And even when the models tell you that a storm is going to balloon up into a Category 5, I think most of the forecasters don't actually believe it at first. And but then you just start watching it very carefully, and all the ingredients starts coming together, because it requires a very specific set of meteorological circumstances to allow a storm to blossom up into a storm of this magnitude, both intensity and geographically in this particular case, because this is such a large storm. So I mean, obviously, I think everybody kind of knew that this was a possibility, but I don't think anybody was so bold as to even try to forecast something quite this bad, at least going back several days.
And as we've mentioned, we're used to seeing hurricanes over in the Atlantic. I'm located over here in Florida. We get quite a few of the hurricanes. But how do those hurricanes differ when you're talking about the Atlantic versus the Pacific?
Well, I mean, obviously, in the Eastern Pacific, we call them hurricanes like we do in the Atlantic. As we get into the Western Pacific, we call them typhoons. And the Atlantic storm, rather the Pacific storms, the typhoons in general, can be larger. In fact, I think on the average, the geographical breadth of the storms actually are a little bit larger. I'm not so sure about the Eastern Pacific hurricanes, but we really don't get all that many of them. And and especially to have one coming up to California is certainly a very, very rare event. Now, having said all that, I would argue that this storm has El Nino fingerprints on it. It's certainly related to that warm water that we have, building up to create the El Nino in that tropical Pacific Ocean. It's running way warmer than normal, hence the El Nino, and that energy has just fed into this to create this monster. So there's little doubt that this thing, again, is related to El Nino in some way.
And we kind of already touched on this, but talking about the track itself, it appears that when it does impact California, it will be downgraded possibly to a tropical storm, or as you mentioned, possibly a Category 1 hurricane, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So once the storm moves inland, it gets cut off from its energy source. And once it moves inland, it's going to fall apart very quickly. Now, if it hangs off the coast, it can maybe hang together a little bit longer, as it makes that march up toward Los Angeles. San Diego is going to bear the brunt of this no matter what. But once it gets inland, it's going to fall apart pretty quickly, especially because of the very rugged terrain that it's going to encounter in Southern California. There's a lot of mountains in that area, and that tends to just tear the storms apart. But even these relatively weak remnants of the storms can continue to propagate inland and continue to produce some pretty heavy rainfall, especially if it stalls out somewhere. So these areas, on the windward side, of all this tropical moisture coming in, they can see some pretty high rainfall amounts in some isolated areas. So, just get prepared for that.
And I did want to ask you, because this kind of goes along the same line here, if this storm were to follow the current track that is projected here, we've talked a lot about Southern California being impacted, but I mean, as you mentioned, other states nearby could see a lot of rain and wind as well. Absolutely. I mean, wind is probably not a huge factor for the other states, but
Arizona and certainly Nevada, I think could see some substantive rain, especially if the storm takes a track maybe slightly east of what they're currently projecting. So the track is really going to be important. I mean, we have this very definitive track that we have drawn on here. The chances of it staying exactly on that track are probably slim and none. But whether it's a little east or a little west, we all kind of shrug our shoulders. This is the best guess as to where it's headed. But we're just not that good at forecasting the track exactly out that far. So again, little shifts in that track are going to lead to dramatically different conditions in various parts of California.
When is it most accurate when you're talking about the track? Obviously, as you get closer and closer, it becomes a little more accurate, but it could still make the slightest turn or the slightest change could happen up until it makes landfall, right?
Oh, absolutely. And even after landfall. I mean, these things I mean, we're getting better and better at forecasting these storms, but they're still inherently unpredictable. There's all sorts of elements in there that we don't fully understand. And as a result, we put our best guesses out there, and the forecasting admittedly is getting better and better, but it's not perfect. So just keep that in mind. And my guess is it'll probably stay pretty close to that track. But I'm sure it's going to deviate a little east or a little west of it. And again, that's going to lead to very, very different conditions in different locations. So, but the forecasting is pretty darn good. In fact, you can see the cone of uncertainty if you go look up the storm, from the National Hurricane Center. And as you get further and further out, from the initial inception of the storm, the cone gets wider and wider. Because the error bars just get wider and wider. The errors are greater with more time from that initial forecast. So again, they're getting pretty good, and that cone is getting narrower and narrower with time, but they're still a cone. Just remember that.
All right, Barry, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here and help break it all down. Anything you want to add before I let you go?
Well, I guess, having bore these storms in Louisiana, I mean, I would just tell the locals to listen to your authorities, listen to your weather people, stay in contact with, your NOAA sources, look at your National Hurricane Center forecasts and tracks and so on. And if they tell you to evacuate, I would recommend getting out of there because believe me, you don't want to regret a decision later. I mean, I've seen this happen too many times down here in Louisiana.
All very true. Definitely pay attention to local alerts, warnings. Watch us here on Live Now from Fox. Download the Fox Weather app. Everything that you can do. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
Hey, my pleasure. Y'all be careful out there.
You too. Taking a live look here. This is our XRAD radar system. Wanted to bring it full so you can get a better view of Hurricane Hilary as we go over some of the basics. Now, the already very powerful storm does continue to intensify there in the Pacific Ocean, strengthening from a tropical storm to a Category 4 hurricane in a matter of 48 hours. Forecasters expect the storm could become a Category 5, which, by the way, is the highest classification for a hurricane, and it shows the power of the storm. It's also a large tropical system, and it's tracking towards Southern California here. We're going to provide extensive coverage over the coming days as we see the storm get closer and closer to the U.S. That right there is the cone of uncertainty, as we call it, that shows kind of an estimate at this point of where that storm is expected to make landfall. It is now 2:44 on the East Coast, and